a smooth ride. One bright morning on the island of Sodor, Edward slept lightly at Knapford's sheds. His driver woke him up. "Wake up, old boy," his driver said with glee. "We might not be home, but we've still got work to do." Edward looked down at him and smiled. "Right away, sir," Edward replied happily. His driver started him up, and they headed for Tidmouth Station. At Tidmouth Station, Edward was pulling up to a platform, but an engine was already there. "Excuse me," cried Edward, for the engine had never moved. Edward ran to the platform next to the engine. He was black, shiny, and big. Edward thought him quite ugly. And you are?" The engine was shocked. "Sorry, I was lost in thought. I'm waiting for someone named Sir Topham Hatt." Edward smiled at him. "The Fat Controller should be here any minute." And he was. The Fat Controller walked up. "Good morning, Edward. This is Neville," he said. "He's on trial today." Edward smiled. At Upper Brendam, he met Neville. "Oh, hello. It's Neville, correct?" he said. "Yes, I'm here to take your train." Edward's attitude quickly changed. "And why are you?" "The Fat Controller's orders." Edward was uncoupled from the train. Him and Neville switched tracks, and Neville set off without problem. He watched him set off without problem. Edward felt worried. That night at Knapford's sheds, the Fat Controller was very cross with Edward. "Edward, I've gotten many complaints about your bumpy ride today. It's why I had Neville take your train. I'm very disappointed with you." Henry spoke up. "Edward is an older engine, sir. Give him a break." The Fat Controller knew Henry was right. "Maybe, Edward, it's time to lighten your load," the Fat Controller said sulkily. Edward was afraid of those words. "No, sir. I'll head to the engine works in the morning. You can trust me." "If you say so, Edward." The Fat Controller sighed as he walked off. The engines in the shed were worried. The next morning, Edward ran to the works and got oil for his axles and joints and headed off. At the station, the passengers cried for Neville and called Edward names. He paid them no attention and started off. Along his line, Edward ran like a well-oiled machine, nothing looking bleak. "Oh dear, what is happening?" cried Edward. "Edward," his driver cried back. "Stop, you're pushing yourself too hard." "I've got it," Edward cried back. The passenger started to complain again. Edward tried to continue on, but he couldn't. He stopped, inches away from the platform. He felt hurt. His driver's heart sank as he went for help. Not too long later, Neville came and put Edward into a siding. Edward failed. "You know, Edward, you had a good run," Neville began. "But maybe it's that time." Edward looked at Neville solemnly. "You're right." Neville noticed that Edward was sad. "I really don't want to have to take your train." "It's for my good, and the island's good. Don't worry about it, Neville. Go on and show the passengers who you are." Neville smiled and pulled into the station. Some of the passengers felt bad for Edward, for some of them understood what was happening. Edward felt ashamed. Later that day, at the sheds, the Fat Controller approached him. "Edward, as sad as I am to tell you this, I'm renouncing your duties as the engine on the Brendam branch." Edward was shocked at this quick decision. "No, sir, Edward. You've been around long enough to know not to push yourself. Today was the tipping point. I have no choice but to keep you from getting damaged. From now on, you'll continue to take light goods trains. You and I don't have a choice." The Fat Controller walked off. Edward's days were over.